Thank you very much. And I'm honored to be speaking to a group of brilliant, really smart people. So I really hope the questions are not very tough, but I'll do the best I can. So I'll start sharing my screen. I think this is the right one. Okay, just let me pop my notes up. Okay, let me change something here. Just a second. Almost 2 years of this, and all right. I think it's working now the way I intended. All right, so let's get started. Yeah, as you can see, not very creative with names, so I just named this talk "Dry Hopping," smiley face. Really, I think what makes brewing a perfect balance between art and science is the many levers that a brewer can pull to generate different outcomes. So just with dry hopping, this is a list of things that a brewer can play with, starting with hop cultivar, even crop years. You know, there are some brewers that store Citra 2017 because it's awesome and has like this great berry character. So they keep a couple bags of that around and use them in a specific recipes. The hop products, so are you using regular pellets or concentrated pellets like Lupomax, for example? The dosing rate, some brewers are very extreme with this, trying to get every possible nuance with quantities, increasing quantities. Contact time, great research around maybe shorter is better for the most part. Temperature, I think more research needs to get done in this area. In general, there are some fractions of the oils that pretty much transfer into beer regardless of the temperature, and there are some fractions that don't. Time point during fermentation, so we're gonna talk about this in depth today. Interaction with other ingredients, from your water profile to the yeast you choose, that I think is fundamental for expressing hop character. And then what are the toys you have at hand in terms of dosing and removing those hops from your fermenter. And finally, things as that sometimes could be taken for granted, as the geometry and size of your fermenters can have an impact on how the flavors come through. So a very quick breakdown of the hop oils. Again, I'm pretty sure some of you guys know how this goes, but let's say that hop oils, it's anywhere from 0.3 to maximum 5% by weight of the hop cone. And in a very rough breakdown, we can say that 80% of that is non-soluble in water or non-polar. So that's a huge fraction that definitely impacts how we perceive the cones when we rub and sniff, and even the pellets we get. And only 20% of that is polar or beer soluble, right? So I think this chart, there are many resources that go in depth in terms of the composition, but I really love this chart that comes from this book that I really highly recommend in case you haven't read it yet, but it's a compendium of the latest research in hop aroma, and Tom Schellhammer summarizes the components in this way that you can at least predict how the different categories behave in beer. So hydrocarbons, we don't have any oxygens here, so non-polar. Woody and herbal character is what we get from these components. So again, that's a lot of what we pick when we smell the cones. And the key here is that, as I anticipated, we have them in very large quantities. I think my pointer is not on, right? Is it? Let me see if I can actually.
I can see it.
You can see my okay, great. So as we can see, it's in very large quantities, but it happens that has very low solubility, and even if it solubilizes, that it doesn't, the odor and flavor threshold is very high compared to the categories below it. So really, we almost never talk about myrcene or humulene. I left the words in Spanish there, but yeah, we don't talk about those in final beer. With the exception of hazy IPAs, it's been found lately that the haze can work as a carrier for these compounds, and you probably can find a little bit of myrcene in hazy IPAs. When time passes and that haze kind of precipitates out, it carries the myrcene out as well. The next fraction are the oxygenated compounds, and these in particular are the monoterpene alcohol. So now we're talking about some fractions and others that are more interesting to us, floral, fruity, citrus. And in orders of magnitude, we can see that they're in way lower quantities. So this fraction in particular could be about 1% of the total oil composition, but fortunately it's way more soluble and the other thresholds are lower. So in this part of the chart, we could kind of include also the esters, that it's a very important fraction, about 15%. And also fruity and pleasant in general. And finally, the polyfunctional thiols. So a lot of research going on with these molecules. We can see they have like very, very small odor detection threshold. So few parts per billion. It's in minute quantities in hops and not in all of them. So particularly American hops, Citra, of course, Mosaic, Sabro, these big, bold varieties, and they're very soluble. So I don't know, it's kind of nature is wise, you know, like you have a little bit of it, but it's very potent and you can still enjoy it. So tropical, fruity, sulfurous, and 4-MMP is the one that is behind that catty odor that is like a way to call it for sure. So just wanted to start talking about whirlpool hopping. It's going to be very brief because this talk is more focused on dry hopping, but lately a lot of brewers have been experimenting with taking down the temperature of their whirlpool before dosing the hops. So this is a thesis from one of my colleagues in Germany, and he did this same beer, and the only thing he did was with a tube and shell heat exchanger, chill the whirlpool temperature before dosing Mosaic hops. And the analytical side of this experiment was really non-conclusive. There were no significant differences in the composition of the oils, but the sensory panel qualified the one that was dosed at a colder temperature as a little fruitier, particularly sweet fruit. So I think my challenge with these techniques are what happens when you dose dry hops on top of that? Are you still able to identify those nuances? And I don't know, I think it's pretty fun to play with it in a production setting. I would only do it if I can do it, you know, like easily and consistently. But if it's gonna throw a wrench in your process and it's really not bringing a lot, I would kind of challenge it. But one of the many levers again. So let's talk about dry hopping, and the first place to add hops is active fermentation. So that can be as early as bypassing the whirlpool hops, dosing your pellets in your fermenter completely empty, and then transfer the beer on top of the pellets. So that's kind of where it starts, and really it would end somewhere between 75% in your fermentation. So there are some brewers trying to standardize this by time. So I will dry hop 24 hours after the beginning of fermentation. Some are trying to do it by a specific gravity. So when I'm at, I don't know, template or whatnot, and some others are trying to standardize it by cell counts, right? So when I have 2 million cells per mil or something, that's the right spot for me to dry hop. So I'll say some of the features or why we want to do this as brewers is the way I see it, for adding layers of complexity. So as I said, whirlpool is a layer, and maybe active fermentation could be another layer, and then post-fermentation could be another layer. Then is to try to engage biotransformation, and I'm gonna dive into that briefly here. So biotransformation is a buzzword in the brewing industry, really. Everybody's talking about it, and the way I really try to break it down very, very simplistic, perhaps, that it's two components of it. One is liberation. So you have molecules that are not other active in the form that they are present, and you gotta do something to liberate them. So it's talked about a lot in monoterpene alcohols. This glycoside. We have here a glucose, and then we have a linalool here, and with the action of an enzyme, in this case beta-glucosidase, this linalool is liberated, right? So there's been some research about it. Many yeast strains seem to have this enzymatic potential, but in a brewing setting, this release seems to be very, very low. So there's really pretty much a brand new research that suggests that we should be looking at other enzymes that would be more operational with the type of glycosides that are present in hops. It's normally like a hexose pentose glycoside, and not only these simple ones. So here's a reference if you want to check that out. And once you release the monoterpene alcohol, so this linalool, but it's more relevant when we talk about geraniol. It can go into different pathways, but mainly reductions, cyclizations, man, that word's really hard for me. And isomerizations in general, but really what happens is that you start with a compound that can be transformed into another one with different threshold and different flavor characteristics. So first you liberate it, and then it enters the cycle. It could also be in free form in hops, or it could come from other hydrolysis as esters that have also a geraniol there. So geraniol is also lost to ergosterol biosynthesis. So probably if you add hops that are rich in geraniol at the beginning, you could lose more geraniol than what you're actually transforming, right? But as I said, it's kind of a low rate overall. And the same happens with polyfunctional thiols. So instead of glucose, we're talking about amino acids here, mainly cysteine and also group glutathione. And it's here, and we have here our thiol of interest, so 3-MH, or it could be 4-MMP. In the case of 4-MMP, is more present in the free form, and in the case of 3-MH, is more present, like 99% more present in the precursor form. And the group by Roland and Sonia Collin is also leading a group that is focusing a lot on thiols. They found that even malt can bring thiol precursors to the beer. So that release is very, very low as well. They're talking about less than 1% sometimes. But once you have the free 3-MH, for example, there's also a transformation component with that one in particular, and esterification. So, well, that's biotransformation in a nutshell. There's a lot of research on how to actually increase that potential through the addition of exogenous enzymes or genetic engineering of yeast strains to kind of improve their liberation capacities. So other feature of active fermentation dry hopping is that it provides shield versus oxygen pickup, right? So if you just dose your pellets and you're adding air to the mix, you know, oxygen, then that yeast can scavenge it through its metabolism. And some things to consider when doing this is that you're in a step of the process with a very high CO2 production. So That comes with some challenges. First of all, you're stripping a lot of the aromatics, out of your vent tube and pipe. And then the moment you add pellets to this tank, you're really in high risk of seeing a hop geyser, So you'll see beer shooting all the way up to the ceiling. I've seen that, and it's pretty scary. Fortunately, I was not the guy that was on the top of that 60-barrel fermenter, but it's pretty scary, and you don't want to be in that position. The other thing to consider is hop creep, and this is probably the moment to talk about it, given that it really affects any type of dry hopping. So hop creep, and you had in Cornell, Kaylin Kirkpatrick was at Cornell, and she did a lot of research on this. So again, from Shellhammer's group, but in a nutshell, again, you have your regular fermentation, you add hops, and the enzymes that are present in the hops, it's still unknown if inside the hops or outside the hops, like coming from fungal source. But in any case, in particularly limit dextrinase or the branching enzyme can start breaking up your dextrins, and then you start losing mouthfeel in your beer. But most importantly, if you have active yeast, then it starts fermenting again. You could see also a diacetyl spike. So anyway, that's something that is kind of a recent finding as well. Seems to be related with hop kilning temperatures that have been declining to favor more oils and pleasant aromas in hops. So this is something that brewers have to be considering anytime they dry hop with active fermentation, or even later than that, as we will see. So the final thing with dry hopping during active fermentation is yeast harvesting. So you're going to have at the end of the brew a mix of yeast and hop solids, and it'll be pretty much impossible to repitch that yeast. You could kind of centrifuge that slurry and try to calculate what percent of that is hops and what percent of that is yeast, but it's really not very convenient. So talking about two words to kind of qualify dry hopping during active fermentation would be something more like roundedness, and subtleness. So with all that CO2 stripping, you're losing a lot of the myrcene of the world, and you're left with kind of the more fruity character. But you're definitely losing some potency there. So I think, as I mentioned, for me at least, would be better as a layer, but probably not the main dry hopping, even for a New England IPA. Next step is close to terminal. So it could be thought as an extension of the active dry hopping, because at this point you still have yeast in suspension. Probably you're 1 degree Plato far from terminal. And what you can do here is just dose your hops, cap the fermenter, and try to capture those last bubbles of CO2 to have some natural carbonation. So really, there are some features or positives here. It's natural carbonation that I just mentioned. You have active fermentation, so whatever biotransformation is happening is still there. You still have a shield against oxygen pickup, but hop creep could be even more challenging. And I have a fun little experiment that I ran recently that will kind of illustrate that. And also yeast management. For example, if you want to do a dynamic dry hopping at this point, you gotta be careful not to pretty much squeeze that yeast and create autolysis and have unpleasant enough flavors, right? So I think if I had to choose one, it might be this one, because it's sort of the easier one. You don't need any special equipment. You just do your thing. You have that shield against oxygen pickup, So it works in many ways. And if you only had to choose one, I would go for this one. And finally, during conditioning, so yeast not active anymore. Brewers drop the temperature down. Some of them, for example, really like dry hopping at 12 degrees Celsius. So at that point, you have removed your yeast, very low activity. And you normally want to do this with a dynamic process. So it's kind of an external vessel that you can perfectly purge and evacuate all the air in the vessel, the hoses, the pumps. You can use beer to kind of push that oxygen out as well. Because at that moment, you don't have any shield for picking up oxygen. So you can really damage your beer more than have a benefit there. It can be a little more controlled, again, because with these dynamic dry hoppings, particularly if it's of the type that retains the hops in the secondary vessel, then you're only kind of recirculating the beer through it. So you can recirculate it for an hour and taste the beer and see how it's tasting. So it's kind of a little more controlled that way. You don't have yeast, so you probably won't generate any of flavors from autolysis. And at this point, you experience hop creep, but in a different way. So, and you probably know this from kaolin as well, that the enzymes are still active. So you're still gonna degrade some of those dextrins. And if you don't have like a super clean process, you're having fermentables in your final bottle, and things can get really bad. Or in any case, if you have good processes and everything's clean, you can still have brewer's yeast coming through your filtration or whatever, and once that bottle is at a higher temperature, you can still experience the consequences of hop creep in the bottle, right? That there's nothing to do about it anymore. So that's a challenge with post-fermentation or conditioning dry hopping. And the word that I want to use here is freshness, to kind of add that bright, hoppy aroma, kind of a last note, like a top note of hoppy aroma to the beer. So that's always a possibility as well. And the last one that I wanted to discuss is kind of anticipated this, but for you as a group of home brewers, could be really fun, to discover a myriad of different aromas. And depending on the equipment you have, I don't know if you kind of have your shared brew house or something like that, or you all brew in your own systems, but this is a brew built by More Flavor, More Beer. And in a day, I can easily brew twice in this one, fill up a 1 barrel fermenter. Like I'm amazed these things exist. Like 10 years ago, you didn't have all this fancy home brewing equipment, home brewing. And then finally, once your fermentation is done, so you didn't add any hops in the hot side. You didn't even add hops, other than bittering extract, you just kind of have that clean bitterness canvas. You don't add any hops in the fermenter. And then what you do is dose the hops directly into these kegs, purge the kegs, try to evacuate all the oxygen, and then transfer the beer on the hops. The secret here is that the deep tube or the spear of the keg is cut pretty much like 3/4 in. And I normally give it a 3 days of contact time at 64 Fahrenheit, kind of a room temperature. And then I move those kegs into a fridge. I have my CO2 system in there, so I kind of put top pressure up to 30 PSI on top of those. And next day, we are tasting those 12 different treatments. So with 1 barrel, you have 12 different treatments. It's kind of a 10-day cycle. It's really fast, and I really like this process. But it has some limitations for sure. So features or positives is you're sharing the same wort composition, the same fermentation profile. So it's controlled in that way. again, with that system, you have a quick turnaround, so you can answer a lot of questions in a very short time. But the thing is that it's only kind of one type of question, right? Like how hops show in sort of standardized dry hopping, that there are no whirlpool additions, there is no active fermentation dry hopping. It's just kind of have a rough idea, you know, kind of a sort of a quick and dirty procedure. Then once the beer is in the keg, it's sitting on the hops, so you really don't want to transfer that beer to another set of kegs, you know, it's kind of too much. So try to taste it as soon as possible, and I think it's something that you could do as a group, maybe not as individuals, you know, but as a group, I think it would be a really fun exercise. And finally, depending on what you already have, it's an investment if you don't have the tools, but not as huge as it used to be, so not too bad. So to close this talk, I wanted to talk about a little experiment. It's not like scientific rigor. It's kind of a fun little experiment here, but what triggered this is one of the classes I gave in Latin America. I asked the potential attendees to help me design an experiment, right? So I gave them 3 options. Same beer, same everything, but the dry hopped active fermentation or post fermentation, you know. Other options were like playing with whirlpool temperatures or dry hopping at 2 different temperatures. So majority chose active fermentation versus post fermentation, and I found this paper that it's also one that I really like because it's in a real New England IPA setting again, right? So it's real beer, and it's screening a bunch of different strains, yeast strains. So really what I got out of this paper are what are the strains, at least from that company, that work better with hops. So they kind of paired that with monoterpene alcohols in particular. And I also kind of copied their base recipe in general, you know, grain bill. And I did a change in hop additions because I also wanted to work with the hops that these groups selected. So it was Citra, Cascade, and Mosaic. And this is how it looks. So in a whirlpool, 2.5 grams per liter addition, Pils malt with a couple of high protein malts, shooting for about 6 to 6.5 ABV. And then these are the yeast strains. So this is kind of different from the paper. They did individual fermentations with all of them, but I kind of blended by weight the 3 that had better potential for biotransformation, let's call it like that. And finally, dry hopping, I also consolidated all the dry hoppings that they do in that experiment, you know, because they dry hop there at different times, in 2 days, 4 days, and conditioning. So I just chose one time per fermenter and did the whole load that was used in the experiment. So same kettle, it went into 2 conicals, 7-gallon conicals are just beautiful. And this is how it looked. So for the first one that was labeled as active fermentation, day 1, so the day after I brewed it, measured the gravity, specific gravity around noon, and it was still not near to halfway. But then I measured it again before leaving, and I realized that if I didn't dry hop it then, next day would have been too late. So really, it's pretty much about 24 hours in. And you can see that it just kept going out and kept going down, the specific gravity, and stabilized at day 6. So day 6 through 9, it stayed stable, and I just crashed it after that. So again, it's really fast turnaround. the thing is that, as you can see, the final gravity is really low. So this is like 2-ish Plato. So maybe for a New England IPA, you would have hoped for a higher final gravity. You want to have some mouthfeel to aid that juiciness. So that's one beer. And then the next one, quote unquote, post fermentation, because really I try to get rid of the yeast. I had 3 days of a stable final gravity at 1017. So I thought I was good to go. I dropped the temperature down, discarded the yeast. Next day, the slurry looked good, so I thought I got most of the yeast. And then I dry hopped at that point, and I started experiencing a hop creep. So my theory is that in particular the Kolsch yeast that I used is not highly flocculent, so probably that was the culprit for starting seeing that hop creep. So, and this is really a creep in because it's really slow. I saw it decline like a 1 gravity point a day pretty much, and I stopped at day 14. So what's the caveat here? That I was not measuring BDKs. So some tricks of the trade, or what some brewers are doing, is that if you're measuring BDKs or even using enzymes to help you prevent the development of the acetyl, pretty much you can choose when to crash, because really the only thing that would stop you to crash this beer down is BDKs. Otherwise, you could say, I want my final gravity to be here, so I'm gonna crash this beer. But I really wanted to wait because I was not measuring BDKs at that point. So let's say in a homebrewing setting, although you have tools at your disposal, I guess, to actually measure some cool stuff, that if you were a home brewer right at home and you couldn't measure BDKs, you really would want to wait until gravity drop is stabilized. So contact time was only 3 days, 72 hours. So you can see that even after removing the hops, it keeps creeping down. Anyway, and as you can see, running these beers through the alkalizer, there are essentially 2 different beers. So one ended at 6.5 ABV and the other went all the way up to 7.1. So if that happened in a brewery, that would be a regulatory issue. And finally, density, final gravity was considerably lower in the one fermented dry hop during active fermentation. But again, it was like a way shorter cycle. So depending on what you're trying to achieve, you can have like a really quick turnaround and just have a bunch of beer going out of the door really fast. Or if you want to wait and try to manage the creep later, then that's something else you can do. So finally, I guess some hop varieties here. Probably you're familiar with many of these, but many ways to split them or try to categorize them. But I kind of went by American IPA that has been going through modernization lately as well, and sort of a New England Hazy IPA. And these are just some suggestions, I really think that fit better the style. So we're talking here kind of old school, plus Motueka from New Zealand and Lowell, which is one of the newer varieties that we commercialized, originally intended for lagers. It was kind of a American-made novel hop, but it's really high in linalool, and that kind of helps the citrusy profile in West Coast IPAs as well. More on the New England IPA side, more fruitier. Brewing is a hop that I really like. A lot of pineapple, cashmere, stone fruit, Galaxy, Nelson, with those like complex like grape characters, and this is probably the newest one. It's kind of in the race to be commercialized, so that's a pretty neat one. Tons of guava, I really like that one. And this is kind of in the middle, I think this kind of fit in in either of these two styles. So of course, citron mosaic, cheater hops as they're called. Like you can really put them into any beer and it's going to be fantastic. The ones that I highlighted in purple here, it's because they either could benefit from losing a little bit of punch, So for example, Sabro, Equanaut, even Idaho 7, they have really positive characteristics, really tropical, fruity character, but they're also very dominant. So probably if you use them in active fermentation, you can still keep the best of them, but also kind of polish them a little bit so that they let other hops play in that blend. They're also kind of, in general, high in geraniol. So if you were trying to engage biotransformation, that would be a good way to go. But yeah, I guess just some ideas that we can keep discussing during the Q&A. And well, I was closing with this. You told me that you receive a kit. So this is how we train in general. This is the starting point. So we do a lot of training with actual ingredients, extracts, fruits, and so on. And really the way we make that available, or at least a portion of it available, is through hop flavors. That's an offering we have. We just made a virtual one a couple of weeks ago, and again, it was kind of challenging, but I think the result was pretty cool. But I would encourage you to really do it in person, because that means you're visiting us in Yakima. So yeah, we can stay in touch, and I'll let you know when the next one is up. So that's all I have for today.